Courtney, it looks like you've got the permissions you need to be able to share when we get started, but is that, yeah, perfect. Um, okay, numbers seem to have stabilized, so we can get underway. So first Biocurator working group meeting back after the summer break, like I said, and today we have Courtney Thaxton from our UNC team who's going to be talking about the work of the Curated Disease Entity Working Group. And I should have started with this, but there's not any general announcements from our perspective. Is there anything, Courtney, I guess from more ClinGen widely that you wanted to bring up on this call or anyone else? And if not, we can get into
Don't have anything ClinGen wide at this moment to announce.
Perfect. Well, we can get into it then. I'll hand over to you, Courtney.
Great. Thank you so much, Alicia. All right, share my screen. Hope we'll get this done right. Please feel free to write during this presentation in the curation chat. I will do my best to monitor what's going on, but I am happy to be here today to talk to you all about how we define a disease entity for curation. And that is part of our new ClinGen Curated Disease Entity Working Group. And in this presentation, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey of how all of this started through the working groups that we've established, and hopefully give you all some tips and tricks when you're thinking about this whole process of defining a disease entity for our curations. So I just want to point everybody in, as curators and what we do in collecting data and putting in semi-quantitative frameworks is that it's really important for us to understand that with a semi-quantitative framework, which is pretty much not just gene curation, but it goes over variant, it goes over actionability and other parts of our curation activities. The basis of all of our curations, therefore, lie in the available data that we have. And so when we think of that, that's clinical reports, that's segregation information, that's experimental evidence. And again, what you include and what you exclude when we think about those points in that data really will affect that final classification that we have. You can see an example here of one gene that has 3 different curations. And again, it has 3 different classifications for that curated disease entity. And so it's really important for us when we are putting out our classifications and our curations that we are representing the most appropriate disease entity for that classification. And why does that matter, you may ask? Well, if we think about just for gene curation itself, we can see in 2020, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics, or the ACMG as we all called it, had formal recommendations for the use of ClinGen's gene disease clinical validity classifications when reporting on genes for use in diagnostic gene panels. In fact, it tells you if you have definitive, strong, or moderate classification, you can include those on panels and you can return results, right, up to likely path or pathogenic. But if you had limited, disputed, or refuted, that changed not only their recommendation on its inclusion, but how you would return variants in those genes to patients. So we know that these classifications are now being used by authoritative sources and that those will affect the diagnosis of patients. So again, just emphasizing the importance that we have on really understanding what is the disease entity we're curating and putting a classification on. And we may think that should be so easy, straightforward, simple, right? We have things like OMIM, the Online Mendelian Inheritance in Men, that's been here for over 50, maybe close to 60 years now. And they are a catalog of what are the assertions of different genes and what phenotypes they're associated with. But when you get a gene like LMNA, where you're seeing 10, 11, 12, 13 different phenotypes that are associated, which ones do we curate? Well, you could say all of them, but how do we know that they're all distinct? How do we know not any of these are part of the same disease spectrum? How do I know which ones to include and exclude in those classifications? How many curations do I even perform here? And when we think about it, it's not just one or a handful of genes. In fact, I looked at it today again, and I can say this has been a pretty consistent statistic. we can see that approximately 30% of the genes in OMIM that are associated with monogenic disorders are associated with more than one phenotype, and that has been consistent for decades now. So it isn't a small number, it's over 1,400 different genes. And so, again, we really need to understand and assess which of these phenotypes are really distinct, which ones are that spectrum, so we know what to include and exclude, and how we're going to score those particular patients for that curation. And so, because we started understanding this was a huge issue, ClinGen does one of the things it does best. It forms a working group and it provides guidance and frameworks and protocols or SOPs for us to understand how we're going to do this work and how we're going to do it in a consistent way. And so we formed the lumping and splitting working group in 2017, and we decided that we would have clinicians, diagnosticians, biocurators, right, coordinators, and we would also engage OMIM and Mondo representatives because these were different entities already, right? One of them, OMIM, being nosological, talking about what's happening with diseases and monogenic diseases specifically. And then we have Mondo, which was an ontology trying to represent those disease entities in a more structural and informatic based way. And so what this group did is essentially look over multiple different curations, especially those of that 30% of genes associated with more than one gene. And we came up with criteria. This is criteria you all learn about, you're trained and required to do. And that is what is defined here. We look at those 4 criteria looking at assertion. Again, assertion, understanding that there's bias in the literature. We all want to say something's novel. That's how it gets published. So we need to scrutinize past that assertion, but we still need to recognize what's been said in the literature. Then we go on to molecular mechanism, and that really should be the basis for many of our decisions on lumping and splitting. Is there a true mechanistic difference between these two entities? Maybe that's because there's different types of variations, loss of function variants versus gain of function. It could be that there are different transcripts that are part of the disease entities. It could be even different exons within the transcript. We also have to go beyond just the genetic architecture, looking at the protein function. Again, out to that protein function, we may see changes. But we know that can be kind of tricky, and sometimes we have gene-disease relationships that are newly discovered, associated. We have patients, but we really don't understand the mechanism. But what we can look at is the phenotypes. Is there variability between them? Are they very consistent? That might be a way for us to understand, in the absence of a molecular mechanism, what we should pick for disease entities. And lastly, inheritance pattern can tell us the difference. And depending on what you look at for each of these, you're going to have a weighing of a lump, right? There, we are taking 2 phenotypes, we're lumping them together. It's a spectrum. We have 2, we know that it's loss of function, gain of function, we can split, and you can have many different combinations in between. This is all to say it's not very narrow and rigid. You can have a gene where you lump some phenotypes and split others, right? And you can have some where you lump them all or split them all. It's just the way for us to understand when we should do that process. And so what we developed as part of this is the pre-curation process. That's what you all are doing before you actually get into the gene curation interface and you go to start selecting those case reports. You're looking a little bit at a high level of all of those 4 different criteria and saying, let's go back to this expert panel. Let's see whether or not we have some information to talk about these different phenotypes associated with my gene of interest. And so we all perform this, right? And it's a required element. And the system of record for this is the gene tracker in ClinGen. So many of you may be familiar with this system, using it. Others of you may be just learning this system. For others, you may not have used it at all because your coordinators do this information, but it's still helpful for you to understand what's going on. And why is it important, or why am I telling you about all of this? Because all of these pre-curations, since they are part of the way we define our curated disease entity that comes with the classification, they're therefore published to the website. And that's what you can see down here on the right-hand panel. At the upper left, the pre-curation is that element you all are required to do. So we know how important this is. And the importance also lies in we're telling all of our users what phenotypes are included, which ones are excluded. It gives more transparency to our curations. It also allows us on an informatic side, for those who are familiar and used to using OMIM phenotype numbers, that they can put those into our ClinGen website search And because of that, we can pull them back and say, here's the curation that might be of interest to you. The other thing is that it is published in two ways. So one thing I wanted to point out is that you can tell all of the pre-curations, and eventually all of our curations should have this little symbol, the crossed arrows here. But another place that they can see this information is if they click into the actual curation themselves, and you have a tab that says lumping and splitting. And again, because this is a required element, it is extremely important for all of you to fill out all of the pre-curation information appropriately and accurately. Know that you need to go through grammar and spell check, but also make sure you're putting those phenotypes that are included and excluded. And just to help you all out a little, I took some screenshots of the gene tracker. So we're just going to go through a little bit of this so we can make it clear on how you need to fill out this report. Once you get into the gene tracker, if you are the one using it, Biocurator or Coordinator, right? Those are things that you need to make sure as a Biocurator, you're asking your GSEP, am I responsible for this? I may not have access to it. Are you responsible, GSEP Coordinator? Great, thank you. I'm going to make sure I supply you with all the information you need to fill this out. Once you get into the gene tracker, you're going to have an assignment on your dashboard. You can go to those genes. When you go into the gene, you can look in curation type when you go to edit. Once you get to curation type, we're going to present to you, hey, this is what OMIM says this gene is already associated with. So how would you like to proceed? Right? We're giving you those different types of curations that you can perform, how you're telling us what you're going to do with it, and if you need any help, we provide those links. So if you know you're only curating one and it's a split, you say that for that one gene disease validity pre-curation record. If you need to split all four, then you need 4 records for each of those. If you're going to curate a gene disease entity not on this list, maybe it's a very new assertion and OMIM hasn't even got to it. Tell us that and move forward, right? This shows that we have some differences between other sites that also produce information about gene disease relationships. If you're going to lump something, that's great too. Tell us. We're going to show you what you need to do on the next phenotyping tab. And while you could think, well, here's a whole syndrome, I'm really only interested in one part of it, which is the autism, regardless of all the other phenotypes, which are facial dysmorphism, we would say, don't do that. Just tell somebody about it. Write about it in your evidence summary, right? Also include it in your manuscript, but that's a feature part of a bigger syndrome, so that's why we discourage it. This is often not used, but if you're going to use it, please tell us. Once you move from that tab, you're going to come over onto the phenotype tab. You're going to see the same information again towards you, but just remember these checkboxes on the side here. You do need to pick one of them, especially if you've picked a single disease entity on that list or if you've lumped. If you've lumped, tell us all the ones that are included in that curation. It's really important. If it's only one, pick that one. If it's none on the list, it won't even show you this field. You'll get to move on. If you are going to go through a lump or if you're curating alone, just tell us what your rationale is for it. This is going all the way back to those 4 criteria. Provide some PMIDs here. Again, double check that these are accurate and provide your rationale. This is what is published to the ClinGen website. So double check your grammar, double check your typos or anything because pre-curation turns into procreation and we're not talking about that. So definitely pay attention to that as you're working. And then the other thing to remember is we provide some notifications and warning boxes for you. If you open these up, it will tell you, hey, there's a few other genes on this list that other groups, this gene is of interest to other groups in GSEP. So just make sure that you're not picking the same included phenotypes. And if you are, go back to your coordinator. Let them know so that they can start talking with that other group. Finally, when you move on here, again, adding those relevant PMIDs, adding that rationale. When we move on to the Mondo tab, you need to pick an appropriate Mondo ID. If one already exists, and we'll talk about it a little bit later too and go in more detail, if one exists that is accurately and appropriately outlining your disease concept, it's the phenotypes and the genes, put that one in there. If it doesn't, go ahead and leave it blank, put something in this particular tab, and then move to getting the Mondo request. So for many of you, that may mean tell your GSEP coordinator so they can get things going. For those of you that submit them, it means go into that request, and we'll go through a little bit later what you need to do for those. But obviously, it's really important for you to understand you need this ID to even move forward with a GCI record. You won't be able to until you have one. So just have patience, right? Don't forget about these curations and go back and get those IDs. So when we're thinking again about that lumping and splitting and how we decide those disease entities, here's an example of BTK, a gene. It ended up with two different split curations. You can see those curations differ based on their classifications. So this was an example of a split to dispute because they do not feel that this individual really had BTK was responsible for this particular phenotype. And the other one you can see it's definitive. So one gene ended up with two separate split curations. And what you see is they have appropriately associated both the included and the excluded phenotypes for each other, as well as their rationale. So this is one example where, again, don't think that you're restricted on the number of curations you can do. You just want to make sure that you're accurately and appropriately indicating those phenotypes and performing those curations, including the appropriate data, scoring and classifying. Here's another example that we have, because sometimes it gets quite tricky. IDUA, for instance. Here's an example where OMIM has these as three different phenotypes. They all represent a different spectrum of IDUA deficiency here. We can also see they have different MIM phenotype numbers that will come in handy later on in the talk, but this means something. But the group found out as a GSEP and they went through pre-curation process and said, we think these are all part of a spectrum. So this is where we have a lump as an example. They're all included here. This is what we're calling that disease entity based on it. And they have a dyad here and a Mondo ID, and then they're indicating that other information. So that's really great. Now here's another example that we have where we have a lump and a split. So again, just showing you how you can have any number of combination of these particular phenotypes. So for the gene MED12, and it's something you'll see later on in the presentations, 3 of the 4 phenotypes have been included in one curation. Why? This curation was done before Hardaker syndrome was even associated with this gene. So that's why it's a question mark, right? They would have to go back and decide, is this part of the phenotypic spectrum of disease as these 3 others that they have lumped and called MED12 related intellectual disability syndrome? Again, a dyad, explicit dyad, which will come in later. Or is it really separate? That's for the expert panel to know. And just like we do gene recurations, precurations also need to go through that recuration process because we have to understand that there may be new associations with these genes, and we have to figure out, again, what's included and what's excluded. So what's interesting is when we started to get into this lumping and splitting, right, especially this great example here, we're lumping 3 eponymously named syndromes together. What do you call it? What do you do? And this is where we came into, wow, well, we have a really great process now for defining a disease entity, but now we've created another issue of we have to figure out what to name it. Do we want to start lumping all of those names together? That's going to be a mouthful. What can we do? And so because of this, we wanted to encourage and develop guidance. We needed to do that to make sure that you all are approaching this naming consistently across all of the expert panels and working groups. And again, our MED12 example is really perfect. What do you do? How do you name this? Well, because of that, we had a disease naming advisory committee that started. Part of the lumping and splitting working group, we have slightly different membership, but they came together really to help define and provide guidance for how you would establish and name ClinGen curated monogenic disease entities based on the process of pre-curation and lumping and splitting that we had introduced as part of our gene curation workflow. Again, really important for us to have representatives from both OMIM and Mondo. Mondo, especially as the entity we're using to describe our disease entities, and it gave us the flexibility to be able to lump and split while they still keep provenance of other people's assertions about a gene disease relationship. And so again, because these are really well known and associated different entities, we wanted to make sure that we can harmonize these concepts. We recognize that names will be different, but if we can provide a stable ID, which Mondo does, for us to say we're talking about the same concept, then that allows us to have more interoperability right? Integration between these different resources and how people can come to them and know we're talking about the same disease. So part of the process, though, of this is we just had to define what a disease is, and more specifically, what a monogenic disease is. We use a lot of different terminology, and sometimes it gets conflated or it gets used in multiple different ways. So we needed to figure out phenotype. What does that mean? How do we define that in ClinGen? And so for the word phenotype, again, we know it's used differently across settings. But for us and classically, its phenotypic features are observable and measurable differences between organisms. So a phenotype is a collection of those features, but it's absent at this point in an etiology, a cause. So fundamentally, a disease itself can be described as a collection of these features, right? And so this is where we're evolving from phenotype into disease. And again, we can move on to say, well, these collection of features are observed among individuals with given disease defines its spectrum of disease. We know that there can be some individuals that present with many of the same features. They could be cardinal features. Some may have more rare features, but all in all, they're within a spectrum. Also, we can see that the disease itself is used as a synonym for the phenotypic spectrum, so that can bring confusion too. But ultimately, we landed on for a monogenic disease that it represents a unitary and distinct entity that's attributable to genetic variation at a single locus or gene, which creates a pathophysiological state for specific phenotypic variation to occur, and it's defined by penetrance and expressivity. Now, that's very big. It essentially means for us a monogenic disease is when we can attribute variation in a single gene is what is causing the phenotypic features we're observing, and that we understand that some of those features may vary because of penetrance and expressivity. So hopefully that becomes really clear for you all on how we're approaching defining a curated monogenic disease entity. So beyond that, we had to start saying, well, how are you going to name these diseases, especially in those cases where you had to lump and put more than one phenotype? And so what we came up with is the dyadic naming structure. This isn't something new or novel. OMIM's been using this in an implicit way. Gene Reviews also is using it and has proposed it in an explicit way. We're just giving a little bit more clarity on how we want to use these terms. And so for a dyad, they should always include a genetic and phenotypic descriptor. ClinGen's preferred disease name, as what will be represented in Mondo and currently is, should follow the explicit dyad. So an explicit dyad is going to be a gene-related and then phenotype and put those phenotypic features, potentially phenotype itself. It has several different ways, but I want you to understand that an implicit dyad is one that uses an alphanumeric to indicate the gene. This becomes confusing sometimes because the one can mean a gene, the one can mean a subtype 1, A can mean a different thing, and so that's how it can get confusing. This is why we really encourage you all to use the gene in that name. Again, wanting to say each disease entity can have synonyms. So you may say, I don't really like this explicit dyad. I like something else. That's okay. Mondo gives us room for that. With these synonyms, it means we're all talking about the same thing, but we need these ClinGen labels explicitly. You may even tell me, I don't like this, I'm not used to it, but I'm here to tell you we do this every day and we know it every day. Here's our great example. People's names change, right? They change with time. They change with understanding. They change because maybe they got married. They just wanted to change it, right? But we all know they're the same thing. And just like people's names change, diseases names change with time. They change because we have more information, more data for us to understand and assess that specific gene disease entity than when it was first discovered. Here you can see a perfect example. Carvajal syndrome in 1998 moved to dilated cardiomyopathy with woolly hair and keratoderma, then moved to arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy, actually by one of the ClinGen GSEPs. And then where is it going to go in the future? Well, because this was talking about a DSP related, maybe that's where it needs to go in that explicit dyad. But what I want to emphasize again is that by using the Mondo disease ontology with those IDs, ClinGen curations have that ID. So it means that we're representing the concept even if the name isn't the same as what OMIM says or the same as what Mondo says. We know that we're talking about the same things. And I just want to show and point that out to you. Here's an example of that same disease entity and where you can see all the different names it's been called in literature by different ontology bases, nomenclature, excuse me, databases and beyond. They have exact synonyms, they tell you related synonyms, and the lovely thing is you get information if you hover over the bubble, where it came from. If it's a PMID from a paper, if it's from another nosological resource like Orphanet, DOID, if it's somebody else who put it in a patient advocacy group, you're going to get all the provenance, all the information, and what this ultimately tells us is we're talking about the same thing. It is going to be that there are variations in the gene DSP that cause a variety of phenotypes that include the cardio area, ectodermal area, and that we could have the spectrum of symptoms, but they're the same thing. So this is a really important part. I hope I'm teaching you about ontologies. I know they can be confusing, but this is why that stable ID is so important. As we see names change with time, they can be cataloged. We know they're going to change, and we need to be reactive as ClinGen to these changes. So I just want to go through a little bit highlight of that and guidance. You are welcome to go read this guidance. We have it published on the ClinGen website under the Curated Disease Entity Working Group now. You'll get to it through the Disease Naming Advisory Committee page as well. So main thing, dyadic names should only be used for gene disease relationships that have a moderate, strong, or definitive classification. Do not use it for limited, disputed, or refuted. That would indicate the gene has some relationship, and our classification does not say it does. So only for those moderate, strong, and definitive. We also want you to consider avoiding renaming well-established phenotypes unless it's absolutely necessary. And sometimes it is necessary. And if it is necessary, that is typically to clarify things that are confusing in the literature. It could be because there is just an effort within the clinical community and the patient community to update names. But when you have other curations that have well-established names, and you can see the example here, you still can end up creating an explicit dyad in a ClinGen label. So we have Loy Dietz here as an example. So Loy Dietz, maybe we don't want to change that name. That's a certain set of clinical features that people are very well familiar with and understand, but a mondo ClinGen label for this, or a synonym for Loy Dietz syndrome or Loy Dietz syndrome type 1 could be TGFBR1 related Loy Dietz syndrome. That would tell you that more gene disease relationship. And why? Because Loy Dietz is not just one gene, one phenotype like Marfan syndrome. There are multiple genes, right, that can cause the same phenotype. We're going into heterogeneity there. So now we have TGFBR2, and this is how we would end up promoting an explicit dyad and still using those well-established names. Another thing that we want you all to consider is that if there is renaming going on, to engage the clinical and patient communities. A good example of this when we said maybe avoid renaming well-established names unless that it's part of a community effort, this fits both of those. Neurofibromatosis type 2 as a disease was renamed to NF2-related schwannomatosis. And this was based not only on the clinical community, but it was also from the patient advocacy and foundation communities. I encourage you to read the PMID to see what they did, but it was a holistic approach to coming to and having a shared agreement for this name. And luckily, it's an explicit dyad in itself. So again, just focusing on dyadic names should only be created for gene disease relationships that reach the moderate, strong, and definitive classifications. If you end up with limited, disputed, or refuted, you would need to use an omen descriptor that's acceptable if one exists, or to create a broader general term. Also, for newly reported diseases that don't have an omen descriptor, the expert panel and working group can use that broad descriptor as well that best reflects the phenotypes observed. Hopefully there are things within Mondo, but if there aren't, we can also create those within Mondo if need be. So other entities that designate gene phenotype relationships may have different thresholds for what they include as new disease entities and when they may post them, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't curate them just because they may not be an omen. So here's an example when we're talking about a phenotypic series, and if you're in those situations that you have a limited, disputed, or even refuted classification. So when you have those situations, you can have many, many explicit dyads that are talking about a well-known, right, moderate, strong, definitive classification. But in the absence of those, we can see that this is an example of heterogeneity. Multiple genes cause the same phenotype. You would not know the difference of what gene is responsible unless you had a molecular test. So we know that as a family, or what we call a parent term, that's inherited retinal dystrophy. It has its own definition, it has its own name, but you notice it's not an explicit dyad. That's intentional. That allows openness for when there could be new genes that fit this phenotype, but they haven't met the threshold of being an actual defined curated disease entity. Once they move with time through recurations, you can start making an explicit dyad for them eventually, and then you'd have your gene-related inherited retinal dystrophy or retinopathy in these cases. So again, remember, no use of the gene name when you're at limited, disputed, and refuted. We do not want to confuse the community. And we'll go back to some of those examples when we have split curations, two different curations. What do you do when you have the same gene now that's associated with two different disease entities if you want to get into that for a dyad? Well, they should have distinguishable names. These happen to be the Mondo IDs used at the time. Again, if we want to give a ClinGen explicit label, we'd say BTK related Bruton, right? Type A gamma globulinemia. I'm going to get it out there. Here, because it's disputed, we would not use the dyadic name at all. So this is actually very appropriate for what we want to do for this curation. Similarly, if we go down into ApoB, we see we have two definitive classifications. Again, both of these are actually showing you a dyad. It's an implicit dyad, and you may say, why is the ClinGen label not presented? We'll get to that in a bit, but we can see that they both are indicating that gene with two different phenotypes. So this is really appropriate to distinguish these entities. We do understand in some cases that may not be as easy, and the only thing that's distinguishable between them is the inheritance pattern. While we typically discourage using inheritance pattern in any disease name that you have in that phenotypic descriptor, if it becomes necessary to make sure that it's a distinguishing factor between two different disease entities for the same gene, then it can be used there as well. So I just want to acknowledge some of this, examples of what we have. Now there's many more, and I really appreciate all of you all that are doing pre-curations and getting into this process. And I know it's becoming even more important for groups moving forward. But we have several different examples here from many different GSEPs of how they've been working to define these explicit dyadic names, but also to help be able to reorganize Mondo's architecture as well, which is really important so we can make them more clinically relevant. So one thing I want to say is, again, hopefully you understand the importance why we're capturing this, but ultimately, one of the things we know is that the ClinGen curated monogenic disease entity sets the stage for all other curations going out from it. So gene curation is really setting the stage when we think about variant curation and those variant dosage and actionability where appropriate, right? The gene disease validity, so that gene and that disease, that Mondo ID and the mode of inheritance should really match between gene curation and variant curation, those specifications and those final pathogenicity classifications, anywhere from pathogenic to benign, because these are ultimately going out to not only the ClinGen website, but to ClinVar. We want it to be very clear what we're talking about. We also know we want to be clear about this because our curations are also published on different websites like the GenCC. And again, just to emphasize why we want this harmonization, right? ClinGen's been curating, well over 8 years. It's been 10 years now, but definitely in the GCI for 8 years. And we've done an exceptional amount of work, but we also know we've done work really early on before any of this guidance was here. And this is just one example, and it's not to pick on anyone because I could find a whole bunch of different examples here. But what it shows is how we can become confusing to our user and even to ourselves. We want to know what are the appropriate disease entities, and they should match variant pathogenicity, and they should match about clinical actionability. This is really important, especially for genes like the ACMG secondary findings, because we want to make sure that we are associating those findings and those clinically actionable efforts for the right gene disease relationship, especially since many of those genes, like MYH7, may be associated with more than one. And so discordance of these disease entities can create that confusion. And so we really, as we looked at this, said, what can we do? What can we do to help these groups? What can we offer? Is there guidance we need to provide again here? And so in typical lumping and splitting fashion, we took two different groups and we lumped them together. And now we are the Curated Disease Entity Working Group. And so part of that group we've now expanded. We still have our OMIM and Mondo representation, but we have individuals now that are coming across biocuration and coordination. Technical teams are coming together really with an effort to be able to help you all get through the process of pre-curation and hopefully be able to make it more efficient and automate some of this information so you're not manually redoing and resubmitting everything multiple times. So our goal as the Curated Disease Entity Working Group is to act as a consulting resource for ClinGen groups with disease naming and defining issues. We have a specific consulting team that I'll go over and show you in a few minutes, but they are there and we are here to help you. If you're having issues with that, you can email us at diseasenaming@clinicalgenome.org. We'd love to help. We're coming together. We can help harmonize between two GSEPs, harmonize between a GSEP and VSEP. We've even had all the way from GSEPs, VSEPs, and actionability all together, right? It's really important for us to have that shared understanding, listen to all the sides and what we need to consider, and then go forward with the best approach we can for the disease name and for its lumping and splitting as we think about these different curation activities. We also want to harmonize those monogenic disease entity delineation and naming, and part of the consulting helps us do that. And part of it is just searching the curations that are already performed and seeing maybe where there can be changes. We also want to develop a ClinGen representation of monogenic disease entities in Mondo. We use this resource a lot. It'd be great to have even better interactions and integration between them so people using Mondo can come back to ClinGen just like people using ClinGen make their way back to Mondo. And one of the biggest things here is to create a consistent ClinGen preferred disease name, which we call a ClinGen label in Mondo. So again, going on to that consulting team and resource, we meet monthly and we review curations and lumping and splitting, disease naming, and we provide recommendations back to groups. We respond to requests from ClinGen expert panels, and we've done that several times now over the last almost year. I think we launched in September of last year. We also respond to requests from external entities. Some examples are we've gotten emails from the SET-BP1 Society, DATA2 Foundation, as well as the Aurora Gene Mutation Support Group that's through Facebook. We're also working to develop and provide guidance on how to properly submit Mondo requests and updates, but you'll see what our technical team wants to do in the future for you all. So again, on that harmonizing monogenic disease entities, again, part of our strategic group that looks overall on what we need to do for guidance, but also the consulting team. So we actively review those lumping and splitting decisions by GSEPs. You may not come to us, but we may come knocking on your door to you and really say, we've looked at this and here's what we recommend for you all to do. And here we can, outline what should be done, and we can provide you the links to Mondo, right? And to provide that connection with Mondo to get this started. We can also be there as a resource if you have questions about what you want to do for those updates and coming back to us and providing them to you. We also collaborate with Mondo to develop the guidance for ClinGen expert panels on how to submit Mondo updates and understanding ontology. So these are things we're developing right now to help put out for you all, even developing our own issue tickets within Mondo that can be really targeted to ClinGen so that you know exactly what you need to include for those requests to Mondo. But obviously we want to do something better and more improved for you. So our technical team that meets is really working on ways for us to assess our Mondo ID use across all our interfaces and systems. We want to make sure that we're getting the information from the exact same place. We know our source of truth and that we can all be consistent on how we use it across these systems. We also are developing a framework for the ClinGen labels in Mondo to be displayed on ClinGen website. This is highlighted because we want to recognize for you, this is your number one request. If you're doing all this work to put a ClinGen label, why is it not displaying? We're working on that. And in fact, I'll show you, we already have a ClinGen representation of Mondo, and that's going to help all our systems point to that to get those ClinGen labels that you all have developed. We're also developing some systematic framework to support harmonization of our Mondo IDs across curations. What this means is it's going to be set in one place, and that's what's going to be used across all the systems. So there's not a way to change it each time and provide that inconsistency that's going on like we saw in different examples previously. And we also want to develop a systematic approach for submitting Mondo updates. You all are doing all this stuff in the gene curation, or excuse me, the gene tracker for pre-curations. Then you have to go out to Mondo's GitHub to develop another ticket. Well, guess what we'd love to do? The gene tracker, since it has it all, can we modify it slightly, have you all do it, hit a button, it sends to Mondo, and we now have some integration talking back and forth. While it saves seconds and minutes, it's a better way for us to track what we're doing with Mondo, the impact that we're having on this, but it also just helps save you all time and become more efficient. And so, as I mentioned, as part of this process and the technical team for the Curated Disease Entity Working Group, they've developed a ClinGen representation. So you can go to this site, you can even Google Mondo OLS and ClinGen, right? Mondo ClinGen, and you'll get to this site. What's really nice is that you can see we have Mondo_ClinGen, and it's bringing all of the things in as being the headline or the official name on this particular representation. That's going to help us bring those names back you're developing, those explicit dyads. Now, I want to note, this is a work in progress. We didn't just default put in a bunch of names as ClinGen labels. It's up to you all and your expert panels to develop them and actually submit them. We don't want to default say anything is anything until you've actually done the curations. And so just know this is going to be an iterative process that begins to develop, but it allows us to create this representation, move things around, update as we need. So we're really excited about this. So just to help you out when you're thinking about your Mondo request, again, biocurators who do these, coordinators who do these, there's a few do's and don'ts. So when you're making a Mondo request, please do the following. Include the official name of your ClinGen group. If you are the ClinGen Hereditary Cancer Gene Curation Expert Panel, put that in your ticket. They are only recording your names. If you do not tell them what ClinGen name it is, we have no way to track it. In fact, you can also add the URL for your website page. They will put that in the provenance and also be able to link that into that little info button on those synonyms and other things. Also include the Mondo ID of reference. So if you already have an ID that you are curious about for providing a synonym or that you need to include, put that ID. If you're making a request for a whole new term, obviously you can't make that ID. You won't need to include it then. So that is one of those things where a little bit optional, but just think about your request. You also want to include your ClinGen label, new or synonym. Tell them that explicit dyad, gene related, and come in with your phenotypes there. We understand phenotypes can get tricky. We are not asking you to name all of the phenotypes as part of the spectrum. Sometimes you may only want to name the cardinal feature. Some you may want to indicate it's a syndrome, which means more organelle are there. That's okay. Work it out with your groups, and we're there to help you with it. You also want to include any other synonyms. Just remember, gene-related phenotype descriptor is the ClinGen label. Your groups may not like that. They may want something else. That's okay. They can include it as a synonym. We can add as many synonyms as we want. ClinGen will still be attributed, but it will not be the official ClinGen label. Also, include a definition of the disease if there isn't one, or even if there is, if it's not appropriate. You have the ability to do this. Provide extra additional information. This is really important when you get into those syndromes again, and you could have a list of 20, 30 different phenotypic features. In the name, that is not going to be appropriate, but in the description, absolutely include it if you want to. That can be really helpful. Also provide any of your references. If you have papers that you can reference, PMIDs, put those in there as they're applicable. That's really great to help tracking the provenance. Also, you want to indicate your parent branch of the ontology. Just like we saw with inherited retinal dystrophy, that's a parent branch. That's that overarching general descriptive term. You get to decide and help them meaning Mondo, say, yes, this is the correct branch. Nope, it's not. You may even have to request a new parent branch. You can do that in this request too and give the same definition, ClinGen label and ClinGen name. And then in the instances where you are doing any lumping and splitting, especially lumping, you want to indicate the child terms for your proposed term. That's going to help them redirect. We do that because we want to recognize that other entities, potentially like OMIM, DOID, ICD, may recognize those as different entities that Mondo needs to obtain. We're just saying they're all part of the same spectrum and we're creating the new parent term for them. So here's an example of a Mondo request. I know it may seem small here, but you can see that they've talked about what is the ClinGen preferred name. It is an explicit dyad. You can see that they've indicated the parent terms because guess what? You can have more than one, everyone. This is really important when you're talking about syndromes and different features, they can go have different parent terms. That definition that you want, include that. If you're lumping, have those child terms written out with their Mondo IDs. And then, of course, say what ClinGen expert panel it's from. They have the name here, and they've included a specific link to this group. So you've got all those elements based on what this actual request is, which is for a lump. Some things you do not want to do. Well, we do not want you to feel like you are on your own. Please ask for help. We're here to help. Ask your GSEP, ask your coordinator, ask the entire membership, right? You're not alone. If you need help while doing a pre-curation or coming up with some of these examples, ask them. If beyond that, if you all coordinators are saying, our GSEP's having a really difficult time with this, come to the CDE, email us. We'll be there to help consult with you and help provide some recommendations for you to move forward. Also, don't forget to indicate your ClinGen expert panel group. Really important for us to track how many of the issues within Mondo actually are coming from ClinGen. Also, don't forget to indicate your appropriate parent term. It's really important. And again, it doesn't have to be one. You can have numerous. Just make sure that it is all appropriate, right? Marfan syndrome can go underneath having, increased height. It can go under aortic aneurysm and dissection. It can go under many different areas. And that's a way to be able to acknowledge that there are different features as part of this syndrome. Also, don't request the Mondo concept as a singular child term for your proposed concept. We'll go through this a little bit more. The main thing here is that when you have a singular concept as a child, you're essentially saying these are the same thing. So, mono synonyms versus child terms, kind of give some clarity here. Here's an example where we have Lynch syndrome, right? It has a nice definition. What you can see over here is the ClinGen label. This is where we're saying we want a different name, but we recognize this is the same gene-disease relationship that we're talking about. So MSH2 related Lynch syndrome. That goes as a child term, not as a child term, as a synonym, and you should use that Mondo ID. So again, when the concept of the monodisease entity already exists, you should submit a synonym, and that synonym will be marked as the ClinGen label. Here's a different example. We've got the gene AIPL1. Now, what I want to point out to you is that on this OMIM page for this gene, there happens to be a MIM phenotype number. It's the same for all three of these phenotypes. That is OMIM's way of telling you it's part of the same disease spectrum. What we can see is that there's a Mondo tree with a new term, but it has LCA as a child term. This you do not want to do. In this situation, these are the same disease entities. The Mondo LCA4 represents all three terms from OMIM and is equivalent to the AIPL1 retinopathy. The solution for this is to say that AIPL1 related retinopathy is the same as LCA4 and synonyms. That ultimately means one of these Mondo IDs has to be obsoleted. Then they have to merge the concepts together and then recreate that synonym. These are the types of things the curated disease entity is looking at and to help you all with as a gene curation expert panel, because we know it can be confusing and we are here to help. Now, here's our lovely example of MED12 related intellectual disability again. Here we've got 4 different examples of MIM phenotypes and distinct entities. They're, again, 4 different entities. What we see is we were lumping 3 of them, and appropriately 3 of them are child terms. Everything that's a child term has to be true of the parent, and that's exactly what we're saying. And notice Hardikar is left out. You can also notice the names are different because, again, Mondo has its own governance on what name will be this official name labeled here. That's okay. We just want the ClinGen name. But this is also an example where no other entity recognizes this Med 12 intellectual disability syndrome except us. So this is where the ClinGen label is the official Mondo label. So I know that can cause confusion. Don't worry, it's there. And on the back end of that ClinGen representation of Mondo we're going to make it all clear on our website. So that's the end of my slides, and I just want to thank you all, and I'm happy to take some questions. I know we have about 8 minutes left, so I will stop sharing. But if you have any questions at any time, please email us at diseasenaming@clinicalgenome.org.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Oh, there we go. There's a question in the chat.
Okay, the Mondo ClinGen link. Let me find that. Okay, I do have it, and I will bring it to you once I find my little area of this. Okay, so here you all go.
Thank you. And maybe while you're there, it might be helpful to put in the how we contact the CDE work group
Yes,
in the link as in the chat
I
as
will
well.
do that.
I actually had a couple of people reach out to me during this talk asking if
Okay.
this recording would be shared afterwards. And so, yeah, just to answer once and for everyone, all of these meetings, but this one most definitely will be available on the ClinGen YouTube channel. And then the link directly for this recording is also sent out to the Biocurator workgroup listserv afterwards. So that was a wonderful presentation, Courtney, and there's definitely a lot of people that I think are wanting to save it and to keep it as a reference to refer back to themselves moving forward and to share with new curators joining groups because it was a perfect overview of the process for lumping and splitting and how you think about what are we actually curating and explaining
Yeah.
why it's important to do that process so
I
thoroughly
know it's a
and
lot to
document
digest.
it.
Yes, I know it's a lot to digest, but you all will see how that begins to, move and improve. And hopefully it's just helping you all to understand what you may be seeing in the coming future as we're changing different things. And I also just wanted to remind you all, we are listening and hearing to you all about these requests, especially coordinators, right? And expert panel members. We want to see these names. And so we are getting there.
Um, But if there's not any other questions, we can perhaps wrap up there. I always try to have a question when I'm hosting, but like you covered everything. So
Great.
wonderful
I'm glad.
presentation.
Try to. Hopefully that's there. And again, if you have any as you marinate on some of this stuff, please just use the email. I'm sorry it took me a few times to get it correct, but it is there. That should be the right email. And you can still always get to the, let me put one last thing before you go off, which is going to be the Curated Disease Entity Working Groups webpage itself. You can get to that from the clinicalgenome.org website, from the working group dropdown, but that you can also get our email and then see all of the people and what we're doing there.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Courtney. And we will see everyone back at the end of this month. I want to say it's on the 25th, but I don't have it up in front of me. It is indeed on the 25th, with the congenital heart disease, both the GSEP and the VSEP, giving an update of the work that's been going on in that domain. So we will see you all then at the end of the month. Thanks again,
Thanks,
Courtney.
everyone. Bye.